difference between the first group of astronauts and the second and third group? Which group were you, and what was the difference?
Well, I was a member of the third group of astronauts selected, and there was a kind of change in the general characteristics of the people along the way. I'd have to say that it tended to be less of a focus on pure flying background and skills, and an increasing focus on the level of technical background and skills that the people had. In the beginning, they were all test pilots. By the time they got to our group, everybody was operational jet pilots, but there were only half of them that had actually been working as test pilots. So it was kind of a slow change in there, not to mention the fact that as far as academic backgrounds go, they were able to get a kind of a broader base. By the time they got to our group, there were 14. When they selected the second group, which was the Gemini group, they averaged, I think, about a year or year and a couple months more college education than the first group. And when they came to our group, then it was another year or more added to that average amount of background and experience. So I would have to say that by the time they got to us, that we had a better grounding, at least, in engineering technical skills.
Now, what difference does it make? Not what difference does it make. Let me ask you this very broad question. How important was it that you guys were involved in the development of the spacecraft? How involved were you with the development of the spacecraft?
Well, for the first 8 or 10 years of the manned space program, the astronauts were very much intimately involved in all of the details, because they were busy building a spacecraft that had never been built, a Mercury spacecraft. Gemini was started before Mercury was complete, and we were still trying to design something to keep man alive in orbit. And when we came to Apollo, that of course had a tremendous technical challenge to go out and do something that will be remembered as the technical achievement of the 20th century, if not for the first 2,000 years, and that is to land a man on another body in the universe. So the technical challenge increased tremendously. We were building new spacecraft, doing things that had never been done before, and the flight crew had not overstayed their welcome, in the sense that they were still anxious to get all of our input. All of the engineers, all of the contractors knew that we were the end user, that we had a lot of experience, operational experience in jet aircraft, as well as technical background, and they were just hungry for our input. Sometimes that didn't work out all that great, but nevertheless, it was a very receptive atmosphere for our skills.
How hard did you work on the Block 2, Block 1 and then Block 2 spacecraft? How many hours did you spend, how many months did you spend helping get that thing built?
Well, by the time, I think I'd been in the program almost 2 years, excuse me.
Okay.
Well, I had been in the space program for almost 2 years when I was assigned as part of the crew for what was then called Apollo 2. Up until that time, I had spent general training, and I had also worked on the power control systems, the environmental control systems, and various other subsystems on the Gemini program. But we did not have an opportunity to contribute to the design and the way they were going to be implemented, and logic on switches and malfunction procedures and things. It was already well along, and we were dealing with problems and trying to keep things on schedule. When it came to Apollo, we were so early in the program that while we were trying to train as a crew, there were no simulators. There were no place we could really train except at the contractor. So we were hungry for time in the spacecraft, what you would call cockpit time, to be able to familiar ourselves with switches and switch functions, and just to see real hardware, which wouldn't be around for a long, long time. They also had certain engineering simulators at the contractors that could usually do small tasks, but not a fully integrated task. So we fought for time to get on those as well. So at the beginning, we lived at the contractors. I mean, I can recall when we were testing Apollo 2, it's funny as I look back, Apollo 2, which was subsequently canceled, which was identical to Apollo 1, the atmosphere was not near as hectic or pressure-filled or hours of work spent per day as it eventually became on what was Apollo 7 after the fire. So we were out there doing whatever we could, taking part in tests, but we were still kind of new to the contractors. They didn't know whether to have confidence in us. They felt like we were a big slowdown for them because the points that we raised, they did not want to address sometimes, and they felt like we were wasting their time because we were slowing them down, and of course they had incentives to be on time and they wanted to hold down the costs. I recall one time after one critical design review that the head of North American Rockwell Space Division at the time said to Bob Gilruth, who was the director of the Johnson Space Center, said, well, we would be doing a lot better on the schedule if you just didn't send the astronauts out here so much. And Dr. Gilruth, bless his heart, and he was a believer in us from the very beginning, he says, that's okay, we're not charging you for their time. And I'm sure that Dr. Gilruth believed that our input was very, very important, very, very critical, and consequently, we had a lot of leverage. In some cases, some of the guys had too much leverage. I mean, we had young people, sometimes very inexperienced. Roger Chaffee, who was on Apollo 1, for example, had a tendency to do microengineering. And it'd be one thing to point out a problem and indicate even a possible solution if you're very careful about that. Roger had a tendency to sit down and take the switch and say, this is what he wanted on this switch and on this position and this on that position. And it may or may not have been the best answer. But because Roger was going to ride that first one, the engineers go back, they would do that, it would show up at the next design review, and NASA might not really like it and would just as soon not have it. And Rockwell had a perfectly good excuse. They said, we did it just like the crew told us to. And it wasn't necessarily always the best solution. So it was a lot of authority that didn't go with the responsibility. I mean, we were not responsible for the design of that machine. We were responsible for operating it and flying it and performing the mission. But because we were the flight crew and we showed up out there every week, sometimes 5 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week, we showed up out there and our word was like a direct manifest from God. So it was a power and a responsibility, a power and an authority that you had to be very careful with.
Great. Fantastic. All right.
We're good.
How much input did Gus want over the Apollo Block 1 craft?
Well, Gus Grissom commanded the Apollo 1 crew, and Wally Schirra was the commander of our crew, which was Apollo 2. Both of them were experienced astronauts from the Mercury program and the Gemini program. They had a lot to say on how it had been done before, were influential in getting the flight crew accepted, as you will. I had worked with Wally for quite a while, but not near as close with Gus. And during this period of time when we were the backup crew, we were the prime crew on Apollo 2, and then subsequently the backup crew to Apollo 1, I began to work with Gus for the first time. And I found that Gus to be very, very conscientious, very much involved with the details, and I developed a lot of increased respect for Gus trying to get ready for Apollo 1. And Gus was like most of us at the time, that we recognized that there were a great number of deficiencies in Apollo 1. Those of us who were brand new, the rookies like myself, Don Isley, Roger Chaffee, we were so anxious to get any flight in space that we would be willing to live with things that they knew better than living with. In spite of that, we all had this go fever that we call it, and we felt that we were such good aviators that, well, maybe the machine isn't quite perfect. We've done our best, but it may not be perfect. But we're so good we can fly the crates they pack these things in. And it was a mistake. Because of that, and because of our anxiety to go fly, we ended up living with things that were totally intolerable. Gus recognized that. He recognized the simulator wasn't up to speed. Gus felt like we were just trying to get through this Apollo 1 and the Apollo 2, which was kind of a Me Too-like mission, very much like Apollo 1. And then we could get on with the real business of developing the spacecraft even better. Unfortunately, that's not the way it turned out. Gus and his crew, in January 27th, 1967, they were killed in a fire on the pad. By that time, they had canceled Apollo 2. Wally Schirra, Don Isley, and I were the backup crew to Gus and Roger and Ed. And we began to recognize immediately that until a lot of things were changed in that spacecraft, we were not going to fly again.
Good. Okay, great. Change in filament. Just ran out right at the end of that. Mark? Where were you the night of the fire? How'd you hear about it?
Well, Wally, Don, and I were the backup crew for Apollo 1. And we were down to the last month of the schedule. We know now it would never made through that last month on time. But nevertheless, we had to pretend like it was. I mean, we had to operate on that schedule. The night before, we had performed exactly the same test called plugs in, which meant we had the cables running in through the hatch. The hatch was open, and we did all the same test, but since the hatch was open, we couldn't pressurize and didn't have 100% oxygen in there. The next morning was when Gus was having his test, and it was hard to get started, a lot of delays, and it was going to be plugs in. They had to close the hatch, they were going to pressurize it and put 100% oxygen, all the things that proved to be so dangerous in retrospect and so stupid as we look back on it. We thought of ourselves as engineers. I mean, it is pitiful. So we had stayed around because we were going to fly back together. Three T-38s would have handled all 6 of us. And as the day went on, and they never did get the test started, and they'd start and stop and start and stop, we finally decided that since it was the weekend, that the 3 of us would head on back and try to get back by 7 o'clock, which we did. We hopped in T-38s. We flew back to Ellington. And as we pulled into the line there in the T-38s, Bud Ream was out there to meet us. We never had a reception like that. I mean, somebody that would park the airplane and we'd go inside and head home. Bud Ream met us and wouldn't tell us why, took us upstairs and proceeded to tell us there'd been an accident, which we thought, well, that's bad. When he said that the crew had been killed, the entire crew had been killed, it was almost unbelievable to us. And as you know, pilots are used to hearing about their friends getting killed one way or another. So it didn't take us too long. I mean, it wasn't unbelievable in the sense that we didn't believe him. It just seemed that's amazing. I mean, it couldn't happen like that on the ground. Short time later, all of us figured it must have had something to do with the spacecraft, because we knew the spacecraft was not as good as we were making out it was as we went along on these tests. So it was a pretty tough time. We also hoped that it would not stop the space program. We immediately, of course, we hoped that we'd get on with it, and of course we expected to fly again if they got on with it.
Tell me about Go Fever, Walt. You said a little bit about it a little bit earlier. Describe Go Fever. The audience doesn't get it, and yet Gus, Wally was all over Go Fever. You know.
Well, Go Fever is something that you get late in the preparation phase, I guess. It's probably not fair to call Go Fever when you're back at the contractors and you're trying to get through these tests. What you do at that time is when something doesn't check out, you'd like to have it not hold everything up, so you kind of reschedule that. You set it aside and you start doing things in parallel. And before long, you keep building up this backlog of things that still have to be checked out. Well, eventually you pay the piper because you've got to get rid of all those things. And under the pressure of time, then you have a tendency to move through them quicker, or maybe accepting a resolution that you wouldn't accept otherwise. Not just the flight crew, but the engineers, the responsible technical people at NASA as well. But we all thought we could do it. As it gets down to the Cape and you're doing these tests, you get very impatient about it because there are a lot of things that can hold up a flight. The flight crew would like to go fly, but they know that they have to get a certain number of re-entries into the simulator. The simulator is not working. Deke Slayton, who is the head of our flight crew operations, would be saying, yeah, the flight crew is going to be ready. And the people on the spacecraft testing would say, you know, hey, the spacecraft's going to be ready. Everybody knew that there was going to be some kind of a delay, but nobody wanted to do what we called hold up the umbrella. See, whoever raised his hand first and says, hey, I can't make it, I need a hold, then of course everybody else would come in under this umbrella and get all their things done. So it was holding up the umbrella. As it gets close, the flight crew is trying to get off the ground because we realize at some point, someplace, you've got to bite the bullet and you've got to go. And there is no better decision maker in the loop that I can think of than the flight crew themselves. As a matter of fact, as it gets close to launch day, a lot of the technical people, the engineers, you'd be amazed at how many phone calls we get or a visit to guide stop by and say, you know that funny little thing that happened so-and-so and so-and-so? Maybe you ought to be careful about this, this, and this. I mean, everybody wants to have a clear conscience as we approach launch day and get off and go.
Inspires confidence. What effect did the fire have on Wally as the commander of 7?
Well, the fire had a huge impact on Wally in more ways than one. Up until the fire, Wally had been commander of a Me Too mission, an unimportant mission, if you will, that was going to follow on the heels of Apollo 1. Gus, who had the same kind of attitude about science as Wally did, had worked diligently to throw off anything having to do with science experiments on Apollo 1. He wanted to concentrate on what he called an engineering test flight, purely and simply. Well, when he threw it off of Apollo 1, it ended up on Apollo 2. Wally was saddled with 2 rookies on Apollo 2. I believe that the flight had originally been intended for Deke Slayton. He'd originally hoped to fly Apollo 2. When he couldn't get ungrounded, then Wally had been put in there to fill his spot until he could get ungrounded. In the end, it turns out that Deke couldn't fly, so Wally was stuck with this mission that did not really excite him. He was thinking about leaving the program. Those were back in the days when we thought people over 40 probably weren't going to fly anyway. So Wally was kind of at that stage in his career. When they had the fire, and Wally lost one of his very best friends and his next door neighbor, Gus, in the fire, we all realized that we shared some responsibility in that because of what we had put up with. And all of a sudden, when we got assigned a couple of weeks later, we got assigned to fly the first Apollo mission. Wally knew that it was a very important mission, that a lot of reputation of NASA was riding on it, that we couldn't afford to have another mistake. Maybe they would cancel the entire manned space program. And Wally then had a renewed interest. He also, I think, had his mortality brought out in front of him to see Gus, who he thought highly of, was gone. And Wally didn't want to end up that same way. So Wally was kind of a Jekyll and Hyde from here on. One, he really wanted to do the mission now, I believe, wanted to do a good job. He always liked that. But I think that also he felt that the challenge was something that he was not going to take casually. It became a problem at different times, things that he would insist on, because he was going to make doggone sure that when this spacecraft flew, it was going to work.
Good. Put it. Mark? Get that in about a minute. How'd you get that spacecraft ready to fly?
Well, there was a 21-month hiatus after the fire. We didn't know what caused the fire, but we knew that a lot of things had to be fixed. We knew that the fire was caused by some spark someplace. So under that umbrella, now holding up the umbrella, fixing it so it wouldn't burn, again, we were able to go in and get a lot of operational changes made, changes in the stabilization and control system, changes in the environmental control system, and the electric power system. All of these things that we'd been turned down before, because they would hold up the program, now we were able to get a lot of those things done. So that's where I ended up concentrating tremendously on the engineering and developing procedures for fixing malfunctions when they happened. And probably my principal contribution to the Apollo spacecraft was during those 21 months.
Terrific. Good. Okay, got it. Did they try to stick a lot of science on 7?
Yes, they did. They did try to put a lot of science on 7, as much as they could, considering that we had to go back and prove the spacecraft. Wally's attitude basically is that we didn't need any of it. He now wanted to fly that engineering test flight that Gus had not flown. Wally and Don and I were probably a little bit different in there because Don and I had not flown. We were willing to put up with some things that Wally would not have. Although all of us, operational fighter pilots, are not very much interested in just doing something out of curiosity, to doing it for curiosity's sake. So we always insisted on whatever the experiment was that they wanted to propose. We'd sit down, we'd listen to the scientists, we'd let them try to sell it to us, and we'd try to find out what it would really accomplish. Many times, we were successful in avoiding doing those experiments because it was just collecting data. Sometimes we didn't win, and we ended up living with some pretty awkward experiments for Apollo, things that were better prepared for flying on Skylab, for example. Metabolic studies, calcium balance studies, other things that they wanted to get on the spacecraft never did fly. There was an airlock that was supposed to go in the hatch, for example. It got thrown off of Apollo 1. We had it on Apollo 2. Couldn't get it off. When we flew Apollo 7, we had enough leverage that we were able to insist that we weren't going to be trying airlock experiments on Apollo 7.
Good. All right, roll that up. Perfect. Good. I'm going to get to what Wally referred to it as junk. Mark? What did Wally refer to the science as, and did that affect you and Don?
It only affected us in the sense that we knew that many things were going to fly in spite of what Wally thought. Therefore, we had to live with them, we had to work with them, we had to fly to various places for briefings, and we had to do the reviews on them and things like that. And Wally was perfectly willing to let us be the ones that had to do it, but I think he resented the time that it took away from other things. We looked at it as all of equal importance. We had to be prepared to do all these things, and we knew that we'd be measured during the flight by how much we accomplished. And I recall that the headline when we came back was we were 101% successful, which really meant that we just accomplished a few more mission objectives than had originally been planned. They'd added a few later on, and we'd gotten those things done. But my thought at the time was really that we could have done a whole lot more. We spent 11 days in that first Apollo mission. No spacecraft before or since or maybe ever is going to go 11 days the very first time it's out of the packing box. So we're very pleased with that because we wanted to be in orbit long enough to accomplish what was then conceived to be as the longest lunar landing mission. Well, to do that, we ended up spending the last 4 or 5 days with very little to do. We only had, we could take like 20 pictures a day because we couldn't carry enough film. We were worried about that. We ran out of experiments other than the calcium balance and the metabolic stuff, the things you really didn't like, these biological experiments. So we ended up with time on our hands for the last 4 or 5 days that we could have done something more productive with.
But how did Wally refer to the science?
Well, Wally...
science experiments.
Well, most of science in those days, I think it's not unfair to say that Wally thought that science sucked. That these were not times and places to be doing science. He was partially right.
All right, so you're up there. When did the shit start to hit the fan, once you got up there?
What are we talking? We're talking
On
about,
7, the flight, during the flight.
yeah, but we're talking about engineering stuff? What are we talking about?
When Wally started to project to what was coming up, the stuff that was going on.
There was no new stuff that was coming up there.
There was a television show to do or something?
Well, no, there was television cameras setting up.
Uh-huh.
This is not consistent with what you're trying to do on the storyline.
No, I'm talking about the science and so forth. When Wally started to say...
Science didn't have an impact on it. We didn't have that much science. I mean, science caused Wally no problem in orbit.
Uh-huh. Oh, I thought it did.
No,
Huh.
no. Only two things. Go off camera, because I'm
Oh,
not...
okay, sure, yeah, sure. Mark it. When they started to introduce the concept, the idea of science, I think you're the one who coined the phrase hyphenated astronauts, which I think is pretty fun. What was your attitude about scientists coming into the geologists and scientists coming in?
Well, we felt like basically they were taking up space. They didn't have the qualifications that we felt were essential, and that was to be a fighter pilot, you know, living, breathing, gung-ho fighter jock. A couple of them had some training, had jet training experience. Others had not. First thing we did was we sent them to pilot training. One of them quit right away. Jack Schmidt, who eventually flew, Jack took a long time to get through flight training. I remember at the time saying that if God had meant man to fly, it wouldn't have made him Jack Schmidt. When Jack came back, it took a while before they let him be safe for solo. He ended up flying helicopters, jets. Unlike some of our guys, he went through his whole career without an accident. I mean, so these guys, they were good. I mean, they were sharp people, but they were cut from a different mold. We also felt like they would kind of undermine the office on our official positions, which was kind of like anti-doctor, anti-scientist. You know, you're going to have to just put up with us. I mean, we're the ones that are doing the real work. Well, you got some scientists in there. One of them started working over in the scientific area of Johnson Space Center, and that wasn't very well received. On the other hand, others of them became just like the rest of us. I mean, like Joe Kerwin was a medical doctor and a flight surgeon. He'd also been a Navy pilot. And I don't remember Joe ever acting like a doctor the whole time he was there. I called him over one time right after Apollo 7 because we went out to the contractors at Rockwell and came back with what later proved to be Hong Kong flu, but we had to leave right away and go on up to do a Meet the Press segment. And I had a temperature. I called Joe over to my house. He came over and he opened his little kit up and took out a rusty stethoscope. That was his personal medical kit. So some of them, they just joined the team. The other thing that I remember thinking at the time, there were about 3 or 4 of us at the time, before the scientist astronauts showed up, who had been, a couple of guys had PhDs, a couple of us were on doctoral programs, and we felt like that might have been a little bit of an edge that might help us someplace along the way. But when some real scientists showed up, all of a sudden that was gone as well. You see, so we were kind of uncovered as pseudo guys.
What was the term you used to describe these guys coming in?
Well, when these guys showed up, of course, up until that time, we'd all been astronauts. And now we had a bunch of scientist astronauts. So I started calling them hyphenated astronauts.
Okay, big picture. What did Apollo mean to you?
I don't think it's very important what Apollo meant to me. It is important, probably, for what those of us who flew Apollo think that Apollo meant to the world. And in that respect, Apollo, which is characterized by man's first landing on the moon, is going to be looked at in history different than anything else in our lifetime, but that's trivial. It's not only the event of the 20th century, the one that will be remembered, long after they don't remember World War II or World War I. They'll probably remember man landed on the moon. They'll probably remember the Einstein's theory of relativity. They'll remember nuclear fission and fusion. But those are the big things about it. I personally believe that man landing on the moon was the greatest technological achievement in mankind so far. And it'll be a long, long time before its equivalent is going to happen again. Because it won't be the same just when we go to Mars even. Because for the first time with Apollo, man stepped out from this small planet and set foot on another body in the universe, escaped the pull of Earth's gravity and set foot on another body in the universe. There's no reason why we can't do the same thing today on Mars. Had we been willing to pay the price, we could have done it 15 or 20 years ago. It's a matter of cost, certainly, but it's mostly a matter of the will to do it. You know,
Should we go back to the moon?
you'll get a lot of different opinions from people about going back to the moon or not. I'm one of those that sees nothing to gain by going back to the moon. It's as if you don't have the nerve to set foot and go on and move the boundaries back farther and go to Mars, it's like a poor man's way to get back out into exploration. A case is made for finding materials and using water that they now seem reasonably certain is at some places on the moon, manufacturing things on the moon. What a ridiculously difficult way to do it. I cannot imagine it being in any way cost-effective compared to other ways of spending money that'll get us out from here to the other planets. So I'm not a fan of it.